So essentially what Becker is doing here is bringing up a powerful dichotomy between what we think on a conscious level, that we will die, again, knowing logically, intellectually we will die, and unconsciously what we feel, which is that in the basis of our cellular composition, we feel like we will live forever. He talks about this later. I'm going to get into it again, but there's that dichotomy between what we think and what we unconsciously, what our cells, what driving them, this sense of immortality that's just misplaced, that's not true. And with this as the context, Becker lays out his thesis on the fear of death anxiety. And he argues that the fear of death in all people originates with us as children. But as we grow up, we push it down so far that we never feel or think about it as adults. Becker doesn't say that children have a fear of death per se. He concedes that death is too abstract an idea, too removed from a child's experience for them to understand at the age of 3 or 4. Like how can a child doesn't even know, doesn't know how to count or how to chew with his mouth closed, let alone an abstract concept like the end of existence. But a child that age does have anxieties. So like most fears, our fear of death has utility. Okay, there is practical utility to this. But we can't be walking around thinking about our deaths all the time, so we wouldn't be able to function. And so Becker says, if this fear of death were as constantly conscious, we should be unable to function normally. So it must be properly repressed to keep us living with any modicum of comfort. So the answer to our question, why do we distract ourselves from death, is that sentence. It must be properly repressed to keep us living with any modicum of comfort. We need to push this fear down as we age in order to live our lives comfortably. Yes, the fear of death is utile, and yes, it's important to our self-preservation. If you're walking in the woods late at night and you see a bear, your fear of death is what's going to kick that sympathetic nervous system into overdrive and get your ass out of the forest and to safety. If you're pushed into the ocean, you fall off a boat, the fear of death is what's going to keep you, doggy paddling above the water so you survive. It's useful that we fear death, but we can't be thinking about it all the time because we would not be able to live with any modicum of comfort. So how exactly do we avoid thinking about this fear on a psychological level? We have this paradox. We have this ever-present fear of death in the normal biological functioning of our instinct of self-preservation. It kicks in when we need to survive. But we also have this utter obliviousness to this fear in our conscious life. You're not thinking about death when you're waiting in line at 7-Eleven for your coffee. You're not thinking about death when you're playing video games with your friends, or when you're having a delicious meatloaf for dinner. But again, if someone kicks down the door and your life isn't at stake, that number one, that ever-present fear of death just kicks in. So how do we reconcile this dichotomy? And this was the confusing element of Becker's literature and really of the human condition. How do we reconcile this? And it's through repression. It's through repression. And if you're not familiar with repression, and this is something I learned having studied psychology in college, this is something that, I think my sister, who's in a doctoral program, learns about quite a bit. Repression is it's a defense mechanism that you use. Technically, I think the definition, let me see if I can pull up a definition for you guys. Repression is the act of subduing one's thoughts, feelings, desires, or impulses in the unconscious mind. So Becker writes of this repression, Excuse me. Becker writes, therefore, in normal times, we move about actually without ever believing in our own death, as if we fully believed in our own corporeal immortality. We are intent of mastering death. A man will say, of course, that he knows he will die someday, but he does not really care. He is having a good time with living, and he does not think about death, and does not care to bother about it. But this is a purely intellectual verbal admission. The effect of fear is repressed. Repression is a neat defense mechanism, you guys. If you've ever been through a traumatic experience, which I really hope you haven't, let's say maybe you've been abused, sexually assaulted, you've been in a fight, rather than forcing yourself to relive that experience every time it's triggered by a cue, by a memory, your brain activates a default mode to save you that pain. And a lot of times memories are repressed so deep in your unconscious that, you need to be hypnotized. People undergo hypnosis and serious therapy in order to have you recall those memories. So repression serves a cognitive, purpose in saving you from that pain. And Becker argues, and I agree with this assessment, that all of us repress our fear of death every single day. Because as Freud believes, the unconscious mind does not know death. I mentioned this a little earlier, and I think it was a quote from Becker that all of us in our minds think we are immortal, even if our bodies are not. And this is where his argument gets really interesting. And this might be my very favorite part of the whole book. So if I'm putting you to sleep with philosophy and, this is this discussion isn't enthusing you, just perk up your ears for a moment because this is worth listening to. So this guy, okay, this guy, Ernest Becker, he talks about how men and women walk around all day with these repressed thoughts and fears of dying. But what's the unintended consequence of this? There has to be something, some implication that this has on our psyche, on our well-being, on our physiology, on our bodies. And Becker says that essentially all of our anxiety is a byproduct of our repressed fears associated with death. He writes, the result was the emergence of man as we know him, a hyper-anxious animal who constantly invents reasons for anxiety even when there are none. I'll read that again. The result was the emergence of man as we know him, a hyper-anxious animal who constantly invents reasons for anxiety even when there are none. Does this sound like anyone you know? It sounds like me. It sounds like most of my friends and family for sure. And Becker was not talking out of his ass. This was an accomplished academic, a professor, an anthropologist, a sociologist. This guy knew his stuff. And he is alleging that all of our anxieties and neuroses can be traced to the repression of our fear of death. This is a truly earth-shattering revelation to come to. And it's something that I'm constantly wrapping my mind around. We talked about mental illness and that, and how, as someone who I deal with anxiety and obsessive compulsive disorder, I think in many ways, a total lack of control and repressed fear of your mortality and the sheer transience of your existence. I believe that this is the root of man as a hyper-anxious animal who invents reasons for anxiety even when there are none.